Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African.
Ghana's president has spoken. Let's go back to 2016 during the 71st UN General Assembly when Ghana's then President John Dramani Mahama posed a powerful question. What happened to the ideals that gave birth to the United Nations? What happened to the enthusiasm for peace, safety, and security that institution was founded on? Fast forward to today, September 2025. President Mahama has returned to the world stage as Ghana's president, and once again, this time during the 80th UN General Assembly. And just like before, he challenged the world to look inward and ask, if the UN was truly founded on equality, then why do we have 5 nations that still hold the veto power? Why doesn't Africa, a continent with 54 diverse countries, have even 1 permanent seat at the table? His words echoed Nelson Mandela's call from 1995, when Mandela stood on that same stage and said the UN must reassess its role, reshape its structures, and ensure equity among nations.
Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, the United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general, and the Security Council in particular. I close quotations.
Mahama didn't stop there. He called for the end of the decades-long blockade in Cuba, reminding the world that Cuba shed blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid and has remained a faithful friend to Africa. In this video, I want to take you through Mahama's speech, what he said back in 2016, how it connects to Mandela's vision, and why his 2025 message matters so much for Africa and for the future of the world. Number 1, Africa's place in the UN. Mahama began by reminding the Assembly that in 1945, when the UN was founded, Africa had very little representation, just 4 countries at the table: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. Fast forward to today, Africa is home to 54 nations, over 25% of the world's population, and by 2050, 1/3 of all young people in the world will be African. His words were clear: the future is African, and he said it twice so that nobody in the room could miss it. This is powerful because for decades, Africa has been seen as marginal to global decision-making. President Mahama flipped the narrative and said, Africa isn't just in the conversation anymore. We are the future. The call for UN reform, the second point. One of his boldest points was about reforming the UN Security Council. Right now, the world's most powerful decisions are controlled by 5 countries: the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. They each hold veto power, meaning one nation can block decisions that affect the entire world. Mahama said this cannot continue. Africa deserves at least 1 permanent seat, and veto power should not be absolute. It must be challenged by the General Assembly. And here's the striking part. He also echoed Nelson Mandela's 1995 speech almost word for word, reminding everyone that for 30 years, African leaders have been saying the same thing, yet nothing has changed. And then he asked, if not now, then when? That question hung heavy because how long must the continent of Africa wait? The third point he made, he talked about Cuba, friendship, and the global solidarity. Another key point was his call to the end of the blockade on Cuba. He reminded the General Assembly that Cuba shed blood on African soil fighting apartheid and has always been a faithful friend to the continent of Africa. Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, said, "We seek to be friends of all and enemies of none." By calling out the Cuba blockade, President Mahama wasn't just speaking about policy, he was reminding the world that justice, solidarity, and fairness must apply to all nations equally, not just the powerful ones. In fact, I see a lot of Cuba-Ghana relations, so I'm not surprised that he brought this up. There are a lot of Cuban doctors that come and do work in Ghana, a lot of people who train in their medical professions in Cuba as well. The next point he talked about was reparations and the legacy of the slave trade. Mahama also made history by announcing that Ghana is going to introduce a motion at the UN to officially recognize the transatlantic slave trade as the greatest crime against humanity. More than 12 million Africans were taken as slaves to build the wealth of Western nations. And while former slave owners were compensated at the end of the slave trade, African people and nations never were. By demanding reparations, President Mahama positioned Ghana and Africa as leaders in the global fight for historical justice. He's saying, we remember and we demand fairness, not pity.
Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property, in quotes. And that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed.
Now, I like to call it trafficking because it really was trafficking of humankind. Now, the next point is about migration and climate justice. He tackled these issues and said that they directly affect Africa. He highlighted that many migrants who flee to the global north are not criminals. They're not invaders, but they're climate refugees. He reminded everyone that the global north actually emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. Yet Africa bears the harshest consequences. He gave real stories of Africans who are abroad, like Judge Mame Wusimensa Frimpong in the US, or Peter Bosman, the first Black mayor in Slovenia, to show that migrants contribute meaningfully wherever they go. And then he quoted poet Warsan, who said, "No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." That line hit hard because it shows the human side of migration that is often ignored. These are human beings. The next point he talked about was Africa's resources and economic sovereignty. Another bold moment when he addressed Africa's natural resources. He said the days of handing out huge concessions to foreign companies should come to an end. Africa welcomes investment, yes, but he said not at the expense of our dignity, not at the cost of giving away everything and receiving very little in return, as has been done for so long. He was firm. He said that Africa needs to negotiate better and that we must take sovereignty over our own resources. That was a direct pushback against centuries of exploitation and the ongoing neo-colonial structures in global finance. The next point he made was about women and girls and representation. He said that this was more hopeful on a personal note. He said that he hopes the new world that we're building will be safe and equal for women and girls. And he selfishly added that this is for the sake of his 18-year-old daughter. He celebrated Ghana's first female vice president also, Nana Jane Opoku Agyeman, and said that her presence shows young Ghanaian girls can see someone like her and they can know that they can reach those types of heights. Representation. He pushed for the UN to one day appoint a woman as Secretary General. I hope that we see this one day. And his message was quite clear when he talked about representation matters. Not only in Africa, as far as Africa's seat at the table, but also in gender equality and leadership worldwide. Now, let's take a step back. I started off talking about how President Mahama in 2016 stood at the UN and he asked the world what happened to the ideas that built the institution. And in 1995, he talked about Nelson Mandela demanding equity and fairness in the UN's structure. And now in 2025, President Mahama returned to that same stage and asked again, if not now, then when? His speech wasn't just about Ghana. It wasn't just about Africa. It was about the future of global justice, equity, and truth. And whether the UN chooses to listen or continues delaying, this may very well shape the world we live in for the next century. I know that for the next century, we probably won't be here. No, we won't. I mean, I'm not going to be here in 100 years unless some miracle, but we won't be here, but we need to leave a lasting legacy for the next generation and generations to come. Now, I'm going to clip the full speech so you can see what he said and just judge for yourself what President Mahama said. I just gave you a breakdown, of each section of what he talked about, but I want you to watch the whole thing for yourself and then you make a judgment as well, not just what I've decoded and broken down about what he said. So here is that video. Watch and give me your feedback. What do you think? Put it in the comment section so we can have a discussion about this.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy. And our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we're progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, no, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on, in today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real, and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification, and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot. And he said, the United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general, and the Security Council in particular. I close quotations. Years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, we seek to be friends with all and enemies to none. The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you will find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Warsan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell it slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders, these are not criminals. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for watching. My name is Ivy Prosper, telling stories from Africa and the African diaspora. If you like this video, please make sure you hit the like button and make sure you share it with other people. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.